It was the dead of night. Exactly 3 a.m. on February 2nd, 1502. Inside the cold, echoing stone corridors of the Castello Estense in Ferrara, a single sound shattered the heavy silence. It wasn't a scream of fear, nor was it a cry of pain. It was something else entirely, a sound charged with raw, undeniable power. The guards stationed outside the ducal chambers froze where they stood, their hands tightening on their halberds. Courtiers and diplomats, lurking in the shadows like vultures, exchanged weary, knowing glances. Everyone in that castle knew exactly what was happening behind those heavy oak doors, though no one dared name it aloud. This was no ordinary wedding night. It was the enactment of a ritual so secret, so dangerous, and so vital that it would alter the fate of Renaissance Italy forever. Outside, the city of Ferrara slept beneath a blood-red moon, oblivious to the fact that inside, a political weapon was being forged in flesh and fire. For nearly 500 years, the intimate details of that night remained hidden, buried beneath layers of church seals and dusty ducal archives. When those forbidden papers finally surfaced, dragged into the light by modern historians, they revealed a truth stranger than any rumor whispered in the piazzas. They told the story of how a 22-year-old woman, Lucrezia Borgia, turned her own body into the most potent diplomatic instrument of her age. Picture this: a royal bedchamber where desire is nothing but strategy, and every sigh carries the weight of a treaty, where the consummation of marriage isn't a moment of private passion, but a public performance, a biological test, a ceremony that could make or unmake entire dynasties. This isn't just a scandalous love story ripped from a romance novel. It is the blueprint of a secret political system, one that fused sex, power, and religion into a single, terrifying ritual of control. At the heart of it all stood Lucrezia Borgia. She was the daughter of a pope, the widow of 2 murdered husbands, and now the most dangerous bride in Italy. They called her a temptress, a pawn, a curse, a poisoner. But on that night, Lucrezia proved she was something else entirely, a grandmaster strategist. And what happened before the sun rose on that winter morning would ripple through the courts of Europe for decades to come, changing the way power was understood, wielded, and survived. By 1502, the name Borgia was synonymous with absolute dominance and terrifying ruthlessness. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, had transformed papal power into a literal weapon, using his children, Cesare and Lucrezia, as the pieces in his grand political chess game. Italy was a fractured landscape, a puzzle of city-states constantly at war, divided between Ferrara, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States. Marriage was the ultimate treaty. Each wedding bed was a negotiation table. Each kiss was a clause in a contract. Each heir was a guarantee of survival against the French or Spanish armies looming on the horizon for the House of Este, the ancient and proud rulers of Ferrara. This marriage was a desperate lifeline. The Duke, Ercole d'Este, saw in Lucrezia not a daughter-in-law to be cherished, but an opportunity to bind his vulnerable house to the most feared family in Europe. His son, Alfonso d'Este, would be the living contract. The deal was finalized on December 30th, 1501. After months of haggling that would make a merchant blush, Lucrezia's dowry was immense, 100,000 gold ducats. It was a fortune enough to feed cities for months, to build fleets, to hire mercenary armies. But money wasn't the real transaction. The true currency would be what happened on the wedding night itself, because in Renaissance Italy, a union wasn't valid until it was proven. Consummation wasn't private, it was a legal requirement. It was witnessed, documented, and verified. The legitimacy of entire dynasties depended on what occurred between two people in the most intimate of settings. If the bedsheets didn't tell the right story, the marriage could be annulled, the dowry returned, and the alliance shattered. The chosen date, February 2nd, wasn't random. It was the feast of the purification of the Virgin, a holy day in Catholic tradition symbolizing light and purity. By aligning the wedding with a sacred ritual, the Borgias fused divinity with desire. The bedchamber became a chapel, the act itself a sacrament. But this bride wasn't naive. Lucrezia had already survived 2 disastrous marriages. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had fled, Rome humiliated, accused of impotence by the Borgias themselves to justify an annulment. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, had been strangled within the Vatican's walls by her own brother's henchmen. So when Lucrezia entered Ferrara, she did so with the poise of a woman who had seen power up close, smelled the blood on its hands, and lived to tell the tale. At 22, her beauty was legendary. The poet Pietro Bembo described her face as radiant with rare light, her hair like spun gold. But her true allure lay not in her features, but in her mind. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. In a world ruled by men, her survival depended on turning her body into armor, her charm into strategy. Her new husband, Alfonso d'Este, was her opposite and her equal. A 25-year-old warrior prince forged in battle and fire. He wasn't a courtier who danced. He was a man who built his own cannons in the foundry, who played the lute with grace, but killed with precision. He carried himself like a man who didn't need to prove his power. It was self-evident in the callus on his hands and the steel in his gaze. When these two met for the first time in early January, in a private meeting arranged before the official wedding ceremonies, something unexpected happened. The air between them changed. What was supposed to be a cold political arrangement suddenly became personal. A spark of real attraction flickered where only duty was meant to exist. And that spark, dangerous, uncontrollable, volatile, would change everything. On February 1st, 1502, the city of Ferrara erupted in celebration. Lucrezia's arrival was a spectacle of wealth and propaganda designed to awe the populace. Her gown shimmered with French silk, embroidered with gold thread. Her necklace glowed with rubies, the size of pigeon eggs that caught the pale winter sun. Crowds cheered. Musicians played fanfare after fanfare, and the streets overflowed with petals. But behind the spectacle, something far more calculated was being prepared. In the palace corridors, the true drama was being staged, not for the people, but for history. Scribes, attendants, and spies took their assigned places in the shadows. Among them was the personal chancellor of Isabella d'Este, Alfonso's sister and Lucrezia's greatest rival, Isabella, known as the prima donna of the world, had arranged for her spy to record every detail of the night's ritual, every sound, every gesture. Every whisper would be reported back to her in Mantua. This wasn't voyeurism, it was espionage. It was a way to turn intimacy into political intelligence. Because in Renaissance Italy, knowing the strength of a marriage was as valuable as knowing the strength of an army. Inside the ducal chambers, the setting was deliberate, a stage dressed for ceremony. Crimson velvet curtains enclosed the bed like the backdrop of a theater, heavy and suffocating. Silver candelabras cast flickering. Dancing shadows across Flemish tapestries depicting war and conquest, a fitting theme for the night. The air itself carried the tension of performance. Here, before dawn, two people would decide the fate of two families. When Alfonso entered, stripped of his armor but not his intensity, both he and Lucrezia knew the stakes. This wasn't about love. It was about legitimacy. Failure was not an option. A failure to perform would be a political disaster that could lead to war. They also knew they were being watched not directly, perhaps, but officially. Hidden witnesses were part of the ritual, an ancient safeguard ensuring no one could later claim the marriage hadn't been consummated in this world. The royal bed was a courtroom, and the act itself was the verdict. Lucrezia understood the danger of that better than anyone. Her first husband's alleged impotence had been weaponized against her, leading to annulment and public humiliation. Her second husband's death had taught her what failure in politics truly cost. Tonight, she wouldn't be a victim again. She would be a victor. She would control the narrative. The ritual began. The first act of consummation carried both heat and fear, a mix of genuine passion and political necessity that neither could disguise. For the first time, duty and desire aligned. The second act followed. This one was meticulously observed by Isabella d'Este's chancellor, who documented the event as though drafting a peace treaty. Every gesture became evidence, every sound testimony. It was invasive. It was absurd to modern sensibilities, but in that time and place, it was law. The third and final consummation sealed the alliance. It wasn't simply two bodies uniting, it was two dynasties fusing into one political organism. By dawn, the ritual was complete. Lucrezia had turned vulnerability into victory. Alfonso had proven his virility and steadiness under pressure, a vital qualification for leadership in an age that valued masculine strength above all else. The official records, signed and sealed by the Este court witnesses, became the legal backbone of the alliance. What had begun as a performance was now a political fact. The marriage was legitimate, unbreakable, and sanctified by both church and state. When the sun rose over Ferrara on February 3rd, the castle stood transformed. The Borgia Este union had survived its trial by fire. The witnesses, the documents, the rituals, all had served their purpose. Lucrezia and Alfonso emerged not as newlyweds, but as architects of a new order. Their union proved that sexuality, when harnessed with precision, could be as powerful as any army. Whispers spread across Italy. Courts from Milan to Naples learned of the ritual, and what they heard terrified them. The Borgias had created a new kind of weapon, one that required no swords, no blood, only calculation and flesh. The Ferrara Protocol, as it came to be known in secret correspondence, set a precedent that would echo through Europe for generations. But where there is triumph, envy is never far behind. Isabella d'Este, brilliant, ruthless, and proud, had long ruled the Ferrara court as its star. Now, her brother's new wife threatened to eclipse her completely. To Isabella, Lucrezia's success was intolerable. To see this outsider, this papal bastard, rise so quickly from scandal to power was a humiliation she couldn't forgive. And so a silent war began. Behind smiles and silks, the two women waged a campaign of wit, rumor, and influence that would shape the destiny of Ferrara for decades. But before that conflict could explode into open rivalry, another storm was already brewing. One that would test Lucrezia's newfound power to its limits, because what followed the most documented wedding night in Europe would prove that even the most carefully planned rituals cannot control the chaos of desire or the danger of love. The months that followed the infamous wedding night were a study in transformation. Overnight, Lucrezia Borgia evolved from a controversial outsider into the heartbeat of Ferrara's court. She was no longer the papal daughter whispered about in corridors. She was the Duchess, untouchable. Her triumph was undeniable. The Este family, once cautious of her, now depended on her presence for stability. Alfonso's performance had validated his manhood and cemented his claim as heir, and the official documents sealed in the ducal archive left no room for doubt. The marriage was real, consummated, and politically binding. But while the alliance fortified the Este dynasty, it also redrew the map of Italy, France, Spain, and the Papal States. All of them recalculated their strategies overnight. The Borgias and Estes had fused into a single formidable bloc. The ripples spread fast. Trade deals shifted. Secret treaties were renegotiated, and in court after court, Lucrezia's name was spoken with a mixture of fascination and fear. Still, behind her dazzling composure, Lucrezia knew better than to trust stability. Power in Renaissance Italy was like candlelight bright, beautiful, and frighteningly easy to extinguish. That truth came crashing down in September of 1502 since. After months of celebration, Lucrezia became pregnant. For the Este court, it was a political miracle. Proof that the ritual of February 2nd had not just been symbolic, but fruitful. But fate, as always, had other plans. On September 5th, she went into labor. The palace fell silent. Hours later, the child, a daughter, was stillborn. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was the child truly Alfonso's? Or had she been conceived earlier? During those secret pre-wedding meetings in January, the question wasn't just gossip, it was dangerous. In a world where lineage determined the right to rule, paternity was everything. Chroniclers argued over dates. Rivals whispered poison into ears. And as if to confirm the hand of fate, Lucrezia herself nearly died. She fell into convulsions, ravaged by puerperal fever, teetering between life and death. For days, Ferrara held its breath. The Duchess's survival would decide the future of the dynasty. When she finally awoke, pale but alive, the city erupted in prayer and relief. Many claimed her recovery was divine proof of God's favor. Others saw it differently, as a warning that this woman's endurance bordered on supernatural But the experience changed her. Lucrezia had faced death and survived yet again. And from that point forward, her innocence, if any, remained, was gone. She understood now that beauty alone could not protect her, nor could loyalty, or even love. Survival in this world demanded something sharper, strategy, and she would soon prove just how dangerous her strategy could become. By 1503, a new name began to appear in her letters: Francesco Gonzaga, the Marquess of Mantua, a charismatic ruler, a man of influence and taste. But there was one small complication. He was married to Isabella d'Este, Lucrezia's sworn rival. The affair began quietly, hidden behind coded messages and diplomatic visits. What started as an exchange of courtesies between two powerful courts turned into something intimate and deeply political. Was it love? Partly. The letters discovered centuries later show warmth, humor, even tenderness. But they also reveal calculation. Lucrezia knew that binding herself to Francesco would give her protection outside Ferrara leverage she might one day need if the Borgia power collapsed. She was weaving another web. By choosing Isabella's husband, she struck her enemy at the core, not with a sword, but with a secret. It was vengeance wrapped in velvet. And it worked, Isabella. Once the uncontested queen of Italian court culture found herself humiliated in the one arena she couldn't control, Lucrezia had flipped the game entirely. The mistress of manipulation had become the master. But this was more than a private scandal. It was a new form of diplomacy. Lucrezia's relationship with Francesco Gonzaga became the model for what historians now call sexual statecraft, the deliberate use of intimacy as a tool of political survival. Other noble women soon followed her example. Marriages were no longer enough. Hidden alliances through lovers and confidants became a form of insurance. In a world where betrayal was routine, affection became a shield. Records from royal archives show that by the mid-16th century, documented consummation had become standard practice among Europe's highest families. There were scribes, notaries, even medical examiners, all sworn to secrecy, who confirmed that alliances had been physically sealed. It was, in essence, the Borgia Este blueprint exported across an entire continent, but the real legacy was psychological. Lucrezia's transformation from pawn to player showed that power didn't belong solely to kings and popes. Women, the very figures dismissed as decorative, had found a way to weaponize what the system demanded of them. In the end, that February night in 1502 wasn't just about two people behind closed doors. It was about an entire civilization redefining what it meant to rule. The rituals that began in those crimson-draped chambers would ripple outward, shaping politics, religion, and gender for centuries. Lucrezia's story reminds us that history's grandest empires weren't only built with swords and ink, but also with whispers, glances, and carefully calculated desire. And if the walls of Estan's castle could speak, they would tell us this: power in its purest form is never just written in law or blood. Sometimes it is written on the skin, so the next time you hear the name Lucrezia Borgia, don't think of scandal, think of strategy. Because in a world where passion could shape politics, she wasn't merely a duchess. She was a dynasty in human form.